I call on Government Order of the Day number 34.
Regulatory Standards Bill, first reading.
The Honourable David Seymour.
I present a legislative statement on the Regulatory Standards Bill.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the Parliament website.
Madam Speaker, I move that the Regulatory Standards Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Finance and Expenditure Committee to consider the bill, and at the appropriate time I intend to move that the bill be reported to the House by 23 December 2025. Madam Speaker, I'm extremely excited to introduce the Regulatory Standards Bill to this House. This bill is a crucial piece of legislation for improving the long-term quality of regulation in our country and ultimately allowing New Zealanders to live longer, happier, healthier and wealthier lives. But the left, the political left, have got themselves in quite a lather about the Regulatory Standards Bill. The hard left Auckland law professor Jane Kelsey helpfully explained that the bill is, quote, basically about the protection of private property and wealth, end quote. Well, Jane, now you're catching on. Funnily enough, she seemed to think that her comments were a criticism. And judging by some of the commentary I've heard from the other side of the House, I'm not sure that they know what's in the bill, but thankfully my job is to explain it. In a nutshell, if red tape and regulation is holding New Zealand back because politicians find it politically rewarding to tie them in red tape, then we need to make regulating less rewarding for politicians by putting more sunlight on their activities. That is how the Regulatory Standards Bill will help New Zealand get its mojo back. This bill turns the explanation from politicians because we said so into because here is the justification according to a set of principles. And to the rest of my colleagues across the House, if you want to tax someone, take their property, restrict their livelihood, you can, but you'll actually have to show why it's in the public interest. The bill demands you show you're working. It aims to reduce the amount of unnecessary poor quality regulation by setting a clear standard for what good regulation should look like through a set of principles in primary legislation. And those principles of responsible regulation focus on the effect that legislation has on rights and liberties, as well as establishing processes for good lawmaking. In setting the standards this way, the bill seeks to bring the same level of discipline to regulating, that is, placing restrictions on the use and exchange of private property, as the Public Finance brings to public spending or the Reserve Bank Act brings to monetary policy, with the Ministry for Regulation playing a role akin to that of the Treasury. We have a Public Finance Act to protect the taxpayer, and I guess you could say that this Act is to protect the citizen. The need for this bill should be clear from the way New Zealanders are expected to comply with regulations when going about their work and everyday life. Those regulations should be clear if we are going to be able to produce more in the time that we each have on Earth. This bill will codify the principles of good regulatory practice for existing and future regulations, with some exclusions. The principles are focused on the effect of legislation on existing interests and liberties, the rule of law, liberties, the taking of property, taxes, fees and levies, the role of courts and good lawmaking processes, including consultation, problem definition and cost-benefit analysis. In essence, there are key questions lawmakers will need to have answers to when progressing regulation. What problem are we trying to solve? What are the costs and benefits, and who pays those costs and gets those benefits? What restrictions are being placed on the use and exchange of private property? And when regulation does not meet those standards, it's reasonable for the public to expect lawmakers to be transparent about that fact. And for the bill to have an impact on the overall quality of regulation, it won't be enough for agencies to simply say that they have considered the principles. If that was the case, the regulatory impact statements and LDAC and select committees would have solved the problem by now. This bill is necessary because instead it will require agencies to publicly confirm that the legislation and its processes for developing it have been reviewed for consistency with the principles and summarise any inconsistencies with the principles, and the results of this assessment will need to be published in a consistency accountability statement that is required by the law. And where an inconsistency is identified, the bill requires a statement from the responsible minister to explain why they believe that their purpose justifies breaching the normal rules. Now, I want to be clear that this will not prevent lawmakers from making or retaining legislation inconsistent with the principles. Parliament will remain sovereign. It can pass whatever laws it chooses. We're not changing that. But nor will it prevent secondary legislation being made if it's inconsistent with the principles. That can continue. There's no statutory requirement for inconsistencies to be changed. The law doesn't grant any specific rights to anybody. The discretion will remain with the responsible elected minister. And there may well be justifications the public accept that there can be good policy reasons for inconsistencies. But what it will do is raise the amount of scrutiny and the political cost of being that person making bad laws inconsistent with the principles. Because the default setting of governments for too long has been regulate first, ask questions later. And this bill is designed to reset that culture of lawmaking. It insists on questions being asked and answered before rules are imposed, about the impact, about the cost, about the necessity, because good intentions aren't good enough for this country of ours. If members of the public believe legislation is inconsistent with the principles, they'll have the ability to raise those concerns with a regulatory standards board. The board will be made up of individuals who have the appropriate knowledge, skills and experience appointed by the Minister for Regulation, and that board will be able to independently consider the consistency of proposed and existing legislation in response to stakeholder concerns at the request of the Minister for Regulation or on its own accord. The board will be able to make non-binding recommendations to the minister responsible for the legislation, or in the case of a bill, to the relevant select committee. All of this will improve the accountability and transparency of our democracy when laws are being made that affect people's rights. And the findings, reasons for any inconsistency and relevant documents will be made publicly available. Finally, the bill will also increase regulatory quality by supporting the Ministry for Regulation in its oversight role, by allowing it to request information on in aid of system of regulatory sector reviews, and also to report on the overall regulatory management system. So we make it a norm to stand up for people's rights, to go about their business and get things done without being needlessly tied up in red tape. Mr. Speaker, at the heart of this law is a desire for New Zealand to get its mojo back by changing the incentives for politicians so that we don't have the kind of red tape and regulation that is holding us back in 3 different ways. Number one, Mr. Speaker, it adds too much cost to the things that people would like to do. Too often we have builders saying it takes me twice as long to build the thing, to get permission to build the thing, as actually build it. We get educators who say, all I wanted to do was unleash the creativity and potential of young minds, and all I actually do is fill out papers for the Ministry of Education. We get people in finance who say we spend more time asking what sort of cat food do you buy than they do actually helping people achieve financial independence, which is what they went into business for. Too often those costs make life more expensive than it needs to be, and that is part of the reason we have a cost of living crisis, which is really a productivity crisis. But then there are the things that don't happen at all. And the reason that they don't happen is because people have been burned too many times by the expensive regulatory costs that they've seen in other activities. I talk to people who've developed properties for 30 years. They say, people come to me with propositions now and I just say no because it's too hard. It's the things that don't go ahead that have left, among other things, a generation of young New Zealanders feeling they have no pathway to owning their own part of a property-owning democracy. And finally, Mr. Speaker, all of that accumulated red tape and burden is seriously affecting our culture. And I often tell the story of the climbing walls, where I understand Sir Edmund Hillary first learned to climb in the Epsom electorate. Today they are walled off with a sign saying, "Do not climb." Our regulatory culture is not just adding cost to things we do and stopping us from doing things that might have otherwise given people a more affordable, happier life. It's actually dulling our culture to the point that I'm not sure we could any longer produce a Hillary, because it is killing the can-do Kiwi attitude and the number 8 wire dream that we like to see in ourselves. Madam Speaker, for all of these reasons, I commend this bill to the House, and I hope it will be a great piece of New Zealand's infrastructure so we can all live better lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.